Professor, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so we're gonna start like in 5 minutes, okay? Sorry for
Okay,
the delay.
no problem.
Just saw your email.
Yes, I can hear now. You can hear me. We're all good.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Hello, Professor. Can we start?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Felipe Bulus, and I am the current director of the National School of Sports Justice. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to welcome Professor Jennifer Rogers from Columbia Law School. Professor, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are thrilled to hear your insights on transgender athletes in American youth sports, inclusion versus fairness, and the legal ramifications of the dispute, a very important topic. Today's webinar, featuring Professor Rogers, represents the second of many webinars we plan to host in collaboration with foreign institutions. As we mentioned last week during Professor Marvroyd's lecture, our goal is to internationalize our court and strengthen its ties with other institutions that play a vital role in the global sport justice ecosystem. We extend our gratitude to Columbia Law School in New York City for partnering with our court and the National School of Sports Justice. Before we begin, I would like to hand the floor over to Auditor Gustavo Valg, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you all for joining us for this event.
Thanks, Bulus. Good morning, everyone, and welcome, Professor Rogers. As our auditor Bulus just mentioned, it is a tremendous honor for us to have you today for this webinar. And please allow me to share just a few highlights of Professor Rogers' remarkable career. So she has been a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School since 2016. Until mid-2018, Professor Rogers also was the executive director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity at Columbia Law School. She's a legal analyst for CNN and has worked at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where she served in numerous capacities, including as a deputy chief appellate attorney, the chief of the Organized Crime Unity, and a chief of the General Crimes Unity. Professor Rogers, thank you once again for joining us. We deeply appreciate your time today. So the floor is yours for your lecture. And if time permits, we will take questions from the audience at the end. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for inviting me to talk about what I think is a really interesting topic and certainly a hot topic here in the United States. And I think also in Brazil from the little that I know. There are a lot of radical changes in the law in the United States recently in the last few years and even in the last couple of weeks. There's emerging research, there's changing medical responses. So everything is in flux and moving very quickly, including political reactions to trans people. So that's what makes it both interesting and I think important. So my plan this morning is to talk about first what is and isn't my focus today. You could really go off on all sorts of tangents about trans rights and discrimination and other topics. So I want to keep it cabin to trans people's participation in sports and the legal ramifications of that. I'll talk a little bit about the legal background of trans rights and discrimination in the United States, some of the current legal movements and changes in the law that have been happening, an overview of where different sports organizations and the different levels of sporting from elite down to youth sports are with respect to the participation of trans athletes at this time, where things might be headed. And then I'll finish with some issues to think about as you might be confronting some of these questions without the limitations of US law, just some kind of global things that if I were in your shoes, if I were litigating a case involving trans rights to participate in sports, or if I were sitting as a judge on a case like that, some of the things that I would like to be thinking about. So first, what am I talking about? What am I not talking about? I don't want to talk too much about transgender rights more generally. There are many areas where trans people are being singled out. Some call those actions discrimination. Some would say trans people are being singled out to protect other populations like male and female children and cisgender women. But there are things like bathroom bans, right? Laws prohibiting trans people from using the bathroom of their choice. More recently, there have been legal bans on what's called gender affirming care. Of course, the taking hormones to suppress puberty or to just change your physical makeup as you're transitioning. And those things have been happening in many states, about half of the states in the United States, so 20 some states, all in the last few years. And this has become a real culture war issue for us, for in particular, the Republican Party. As I'm sure you all know, in our dual sovereignty system, the federal government can pass laws if there's a federal interest, but a lot of laws are left to the states. And this is an area that is primarily left to the states. So about half the states, those that are governed by Republicans, have been passing laws like this, banning transgender people from doing all sorts of things, including participating in sports. Now that we have changed hands of our federal government and President Trump is in office for the last 2 weeks, we've also seen a flurry of executive orders on the federal level, declaring that as far as the federal government is concerned, there are no transgender people, there are only two sexes, and your sex is only what you had at birth. You cannot serve in the military if you're trans. It bans federal facilities from recognizing trans people or providing gender affirming care. It's moving trans women to men's prisons. You know, there's all sorts of things going on here in the US. And as you would expect, litigation against those things. So there's a lot of things happening, and some of the things that have been happening involve sports. So I do want to kind of focus in on that because otherwise we could get lost talking about and debating all these very interesting hot button issues, but we want to focus in. Okay, I'm also only going to talk really about what's happening in the United States. I did do a little poking around about what's going on in Brazil with respect to trans rights and discrimination. It seems to me there are some similarities there. I saw that you do have laws in place protecting transgender rights, but also some laws in recent years in many states that are arguably discriminatory, and that public opinion is mixed. So that sounds a lot like the US, honestly. So perhaps that means that this will be helpful to you all as you likely will confront some of these same topics that are coming to our courts. Of course, as an aside, you have a specialty court, a sports court that we don't have that I wish we had. But, you know, our fights over transgender rights, including in the sports realm, are going, of course, to our regular courts, which don't have any particular expertise in that. So I like your system a lot in that sense for sports disputes. But, you know, I suspect you may be seeing some of these matters. And if we have time, I actually would love to hear about that, whether you are seeing these kinds of cases and what they're looking like. But lastly, in terms of what we're really not talking about, I'm not going to focus on DSD athletes. I want to focus really on transgender athletes. DSD athletes, of course, refer to athletes with differences of sex development, chromosomal or otherwise, like famously Caster Semenya, the South African runner, and other notable cases, including, I think, the two boxers who generated some controversy from last summer's Olympics, Aman Khalifa of Algeria and Lin Yuting of Taiwan. A lot is still unclear about them. There wasn't a lot of information released, but it was said that they were definitely not transgender, so they likely have some sort of DSD status. But while there are a lot of similarities between DSD athletes and trans athletes in terms of how the rules and the laws are dealing with them, there are still differences. There's differences around the rhetoric of choice that the people saying that trans athletes should not be able to participate are facing. There's an even smaller number of DSD athletes than there are of trans athletes, which is already very small. It's also different because the hormonal treatments, the drugs to lower testosterone level that are typically required in elite sports and in college sports are usually already being taken by transgender athletes who have transitioned or are transitioning, but not necessarily for DSD athletes who just are who they are and don't necessarily want to take drugs to artificially lower their testosterone or do anything else to them, particularly as elite athletes. So there's some extra challenges, excuse me, that make DSD athletes, to me, a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to set them to the side as well. In terms you cannot discriminate against employees because of their sexual or gender identity, because that is a form of sex discrimination, which is prohibited by Title VII. So on the books is a law that says that you can't discriminate against transgender people for being transgender, at least in the workplace. So that's a helpful precedent for trans athletes trying to fight against bans to their participation, but it is likely not the last word. We also have a case from this term that has not yet been decided, although it's been argued, called Scrimetti versus Kentucky, that's about gender affirming care and whether the state of Kentucky can ban it. We're still waiting for that decision. That is arguably more important to the transgender community than sports participation. I'm a big proponent of sports for young people. I'm sure you all are as well. It's important socially, developmentally, physically, in all sorts of ways, but it doesn't compare to the need to get the medical attention that someone needs if they're trans and they have gender dysphoria. So this is a really critical case, not yet decided, but that will probably give us a better clue as to where this Supreme Court is headed. And I think most people think that with the 6-3 strong Republican majority on the court and their overruling of our Roe versus Wade, guaranteeing abortion rights, in the process saying there is no privacy right in the Constitution as was previously recognized. I think many people are concerned, and I'm concerned, that the court will not find a constitutional right to that kind of care as long as states have a rational basis for it, which can mean just about anything, as long as the states can prove that rational basis. So we're a little bit at a crossroads. It's still an open question whether Title IX Our Title IX, which requires men and women to be treated equally when it comes to educational opportunities, including sports, is governed by the Bostock decision. If it is, trans people will be able to claim that they have a right not to be discriminated against in connection with school sports, including at the university level. The problem is with the current administration, what we may see, since the US Supreme Court has not considered this question, and there isn't a case that is primed to get up there in the next few months, we may see an executive order and then guidance from the Department of Education that says it interprets Title IX to exclude trans girls and women from participating in sports, and that would effectively lead to a federal ban prohibiting trans girls and women from participating in sports. So that likely wouldn't impact the United States professional women's leagues or the Olympics. But if that takes effect, if that happens and it's not stopped by litigation, it's going to be obviously a huge setback, stopping trans women and girls from participating in sports here in the US. And what's the likelihood if you can't participate in your childhood, in high school, in college, that you actually could make it to a professional league, right? Or to the Olympics? Virtually none. So we're waiting to see what happens legally. There are some other possible arguments that might apply, like using the Americans with Disabilities Act, saying that a diagnosis of gender dysphoria means that under the ADA, one can't be discriminated against, and requiring affirmative accommodations. That issue is also unresolved. And some of the folks like the American Civil Liberties Union and other groups that litigate these sorts of cases are, using that as well, trying to use that. But at this moment, I would say, kind of looking to the future, it looks pretty bleak for the participation of trans girls and women in sports in the US. And soon all of the current rules and guidelines that are currently in place that I'm about to talk about might be irrelevant because there might just be an overall ban, but we're waiting to see. But putting that depressing news, at least for those who want to support such participation, aside for the moment, what is the law? What are the rules as far as different levels of sports participation? Well, starting at the top, the professional leagues make their own minds up about these sorts of things. For example, the National Women's Soccer League places limits on players who are born male and who now identify as women. There's a testosterone level that they must meet, that they must stay below in order to play in the league. The WNBA actually has yet to really take the issue head on. They say only that only women can play in the WNBA, but then they don't go on to define what women means. So that really tells us basically nothing. And they don't seem to be in any rush to go further into this topic. Olympic athletes, as you all may well know, there's a long history of subjecting women to all sorts of tests about whether they are truly women, whether they should be allowed to participate on the women's side in sports. There were visual body tests, there are chromosomal tests, other gender verification procedures over the years that have been implemented. In 2003, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC policy, required a legal and surgical sex change plus hormone therapy in order for someone born male to be allowed to compete in the female category. In 2015, they removed the surgical requirement, but left the other requirements. In 2021, the IOC guidance, and many people and where it was, and those people were disappointed because all it said was it had some nice kind of general language about inclusion and everyone should be included unless there's really a reason not to include them. But ultimately, they punted and said that each sport, its international federation, would decide eligibility, and that the IOC would defer to these international federations for each sport in determining who could participate. And in a way that's understandable, right? Sports are different. You could see how for some sports, it's more important to have a stricter rule. In other sports, it's not so important, right? Depending on whether it's a contact sport and how important things that testosterone help, like sheer strength, how important that is in the performance of the sport. But on the other hand, it makes for a hodgepodge and no real leadership by the IOC on this issue. So one of the main international federations that has been active in trying to find the right levels and rules, in part because they had to contend with Caster Semenya, the DSD athlete I mentioned earlier, is World Athletics, which is the track and field federation. They issued protocols for testosterone levels, and it's been going down, down, down the level that you have to meet, lower, lower, lower over the years. In 2011, it was 10 nanomoles per liter. That's the maximal allowed amount of testosterone. In 2018, they lowered it to 5. In 2023, it was lowered again to 2.5, which actually is below the upper level of the range that normal cisgender women fall into, which is between 1 and 3.3. So the new requirements are really, really low. Specifically with respect to trans athletes, these testosterone levels don't specify trans athletes versus DSD athletes. They just say, if you want to compete as a woman, this is the testosterone level that you have to meet. But specifically with respect to trans athletes, the World Athletics policy had been, as of 1990, that athletes who transitioned before puberty could compete, period. That was a good policy that has now kind of been overtaken by the policy about testosterone levels. Although athletes who transition before puberty and continue to take the drug should fit within their requirements, albeit perhaps not the latest one at 2.5 nanomoles. It'd be interesting to see if we ever see a case where a trans athlete who transitioned before puberty, never went through male puberty, and has a testosterone level between 2.5 and say 3.3, wants to litigate that, where we will be. But that will be a question for another day. Other international federations differ in terms of the requirements that they place on trans athletes. There aren't any outright bans, but many also, like World Athletics, have testosterone limits in place for DSD and trans athletes, like swimming and other federations. But that's where that currently stands. In the US colleges and universities, we have a similar situation where the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, which is the all of the college chambers in, generally speaking, in other ways. They came out with a trans policy in 2010 requiring hormone testosterone suppression for 1 year before competition. Now they take the same position as the IOC does, which is that it's up to the individual sport federations, the national federations, which of course follow the international federations levels. But that only governs NCAA competitions like the national championships in any given sport. If you attend college in a state that has a trans sports ban, you may be prohibited from competing. Even if you could compete in the NCAA tournaments that are governed by the NCAA policy, you might, in the regular kind of league play and just being on the team, you might be prohibited by the laws of the state in which your college is situated. It's certainly going to be the case for public universities, which are under state control. It's even potentially true for private universities that take state funding, although we haven't seen that happen yet. We haven't seen any litigation on that topic, so that's an open question. In high school and below, it's up to the states. As I mentioned earlier, about half of the states now Those states that are led by Republicans have laws banning or restricting the participation of trans athletes in youth sports. And I'll just say there's a big difference between high school athletes who are of the age to have gone through puberty and young children. I don't personally think there's any reason to prohibit a trans girl from participating on a soccer team when she's 8 years old. But most of these laws just have a very, very broad brush. They don't really take a lot of time to distinguish between levels because their whole point is trans people don't exist. There is no trans, and so they don't allow any participation at all. So, what is the right answer here? If you have a case where a trans athlete is challenging restrictions that have been applied to her, participating by a sports league, a federation, a school, etc., what are the issues to be looking at? Obviously, what happens in your case in legal terms relies upon what exact laws you have and other governing principles, like what your constitution provides, what your standard of review is, et cetera. But I want to talk about some general principles that may come into play. And one is the motivation behind exclusion or strict rules. So, I would think about who has set the rule. Is this part of kind of the political culture wars? Is this activism in the name of fairness to cisgender girls or women? Who are your litigants? How did this law come into play? Is it a kind of a cut and paste job from other legislation or rules? In the US, one thing we have seen is that the legislation that kind of jumped from state to state to state as these things all started proliferating in about 2021 were all the same language. There were right-wing advocacy groups behind the efforts to put these into state legislatures, and they were just using the same templates going from state to state to state. So is that what's happening? I would also think about, is it a solution in search of a problem? Meaning, are there actually trans girls and women who are playing sports there and are winning sports there at the supposed expense of cis girls and women? I would think about, is there a true safety issue here? If that's one of the claims, what kind of sports are we talking about? And all of that raises a very interesting point about how this movement has developed in the United States, at least. In some ways, this is a fairly typical Republican conservative-led culture wars issue or a political issue. That's how the groups that have pushed and drafted and passed these legislations have identified it. It's an issue of very high priority for the Republican Party in the United States right now. President Trump campaigned on this issue, and these positions basically banning trans people from participating in federal government life and saying that there is no trans or only two genders, and the one you're in is the one you were born in. That was some of his first orders of business as president, and the Republicans in the states have led the way in the efforts there. But they have, interestingly, some unusual allies in this area that you wouldn't expect. Most of our, in the US, are kind of truly hardcore political issues or culture war issues, have the conservatives on one side, the progressives on the other side. This one has been a little bit different because they've been able to recruit some women's groups and women's athlete groups that otherwise would skew more progressive, but have adopted this issue because of their concerns, their stated concerns about fairness to the cis girls and cis women having to compete against trans girls and trans women. So that concern is understandable. Honestly, I've thought about it myself. How would I feel if I were an athlete and, I was competing in an individual sport against a trans woman, would I feel that that's unfair somehow? My daughter plays a competitive sport. She's a teenager. How do I feel about her competing against trans girls? So I've thought about these issues and I understand the initial concern. But the problem is that the involvement of these groups, who I think are acting in good faith to raise issues that are troubling them, is giving some cover, right, to the primary architects of this movement, whose motivation is really not to protect cisgender girls and women from having to compete. It is to really eradicate transgender people from life, from being able to participate in sports, and from many other ways that I've already mentioned. So, I would be thinking about that, and not as like, I'm not at all saying that you all as judges should look at the motivations of the law and decide who's a good person, who's a bad person, and rule accordingly. But of course, as you're thinking about what the law is that you're considering, what the rule is that you're considering, whether it passes muster, if it's like the United States, one of the things you're thinking about is whether it's as if it does what it is intended to do, and whether it is as narrowly drawn as possible in order to do that thing. And so that's where I think that the motivations come into play, is when you're thinking about that aspect of it. I also just want to say a few words about fairness here. And this isn't really based on science or hard data. But just in thinking further, as I have, about whether this is fair, whether it's fair for cisgender girls and women to compete against trans girls and women. You know, in sports, as we all know, there's a lot that isn't fair, right? There's a lot of people who have talent, who have physical gifts, financial resources, and other things that keep the playing field uneven or unfair, but it's not considered unfair in our system. Things like height, coordination, wingspan, muscle definition, lung capacity, the money to pay for things like private coaches and camps, the luck involved in being born into a family that supports your sports dreams, and parents who are willing to drive you around to tournaments all over the place and that sort of thing. I mean, most people aren't like your Pele, or, to give a more recent example, your Rebecca Andrade, right? And of course, hard work, while necessary, doesn't level the playing field either, when you're thinking about these incredible athletes that have these gifts and who got this opportunity. So, fairness is relative. We want things to be fair to a degree, but there's an inherent element of unfairness in sports in many ways. And so this desire for fairness needs to be balanced against some of the other interests, like inclusion, right? Making sports something that everyone can do. And I would argue it's even more important for trans kids than it is for your average kid, because of the struggles that they're already having, right? Trying to figure out who they are, how they fit into the world, often dealing with discrimination and abuse from their peers. Not to mention the mental challenges involved in grappling with their dysphoria, going through the process of coming out, telling their family, getting medical help, and so on, living in the wrong body. So I think it's an important issue intellectually to grapple with, this fairness versus inclusion question. I mean, we could say you're not allowed to play basketball unless you're between 5, 8, and 6 foot, because we want it to be as fair as possible. And this giant who's almost 7 feet tall, it's just unfair, right? He can just do so much more than the rest of us can do. But how do you say that to that guy? He wants to play basketball. He didn't get to be almost 7 feet by his own desire, right? So it's not his choice. So we don't prohibit him from playing. And in the same way, I would say we should consider whether inclusion is a more important principle than exact fairness, particularly when we have, in the higher levels, the more elite levels of sports, college play and beyond, Olympic athletes and so on, when we have the rules already in place to try to ensure as much as possible the fairness aspect with the testosterone levels and so on. Okay, so turning to that, in terms of the science is definitely not great here, unsettled, not yet, we haven't yet figured out exactly what the impact of all of this is. The work with the testosterone levels trying to level the playing field. We don't even know what the impact is of someone being born male in the first place, male puberty, all of it. So there are really two issues which are rarely separated out and considered thoughtfully, in my view, in this debate. One is the simple impact of testosterone on athletic performance. Do people with higher testosterone, as a general matter, have an athletic advantage? This, of course, is overly simplistic because testosterone is not the only hormone that impacts your athletic ability or that impacts sex development. It's not just testosterone levels that are different between people born as boys and people born as girls, either before or after they go through puberty. And there's no evidence to show that the difference in testosterone levels in men, for example, like a man that has 8.5 nanomoles of testosterone versus one that has 7, that makes any difference in their athletic prowess. But obviously, we know that testosterone has some impact on things that do affect athletic performance, things like muscle mass and strength. That's why testosterone was prohibited by the anti-doping laws. So testosterone has become accepted as the one thing, either the one thing that has the greatest impact, or at least one thing that we can measure and control to try to level the playing field as much as possible. And, that's kind of where we are. And also it's true, of course, that cisgender men do as a group typically have significantly higher testosterone levels than cis women once they've gone through puberty. There are exceptions with the DSD athletes, as I said, which we're putting aside, and even sometimes some overlap at the edges. So it's not foolproof, but it's not a terrible measure in the absence of better science. The second piece of the debate where there really has not been there's just not been enough study by a long shot to reach a reliable conclusion. And that's whether trans women who went through male puberty, but then transitioned afterwards, which includes, of course, taking hormones that suppress testosterone, even usually down to the levels required by whatever rules are in place, whether those people, those transgender women, still have a demonstrable athletic advantage over cisgender women. So we have a few cases to look at, but they are just, there just haven't been enough studies done because there are just not enough transgender athletes to study. But there are a few more anecdotal cases. So Leah Thomas is a transgender woman who was a swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania here. She transitioned from male to female after puberty. She took testosterone suppression drugs to get her level down to what was required by USA Swimming, which is required by the NCAA rules to swim in NCAA competitions. She didn't always win. You'd think maybe she blew everybody out of the water. She didn't, but she won some. And so she became kind of the poster child for these post-puberty trans athletes. But again, we just don't know. We don't know whether she won because she had gone through male puberty, even though her testosterone levels at the time of competition were in line with the cisgender women against whom she was competing. We don't know whether it was puberty that did that or what. So we need a lot more studies and with more people, more trans people participating before we really have any answers there. But a corollary issue is that trans women and girls who have not gone through male puberty, who suppress puberty with puberty blockers before they go through puberty, have never been shown to have any physiological or athletic advantages at all. There's no proof of that at all. So any efforts to say that if you're born male, you cannot compete against women ever or girls, no matter what, no matter whether you block puberty or not, There's no support for that. And that's definitely what's happening in the US. Now, that's not to say that it's impossible that there are some benefits that we just don't know about, because again, this just hasn't been studied. Is it possible that being born male gives you athletic advantages against people born female, even if you never go through puberty, so you don't go through that phase of, growing and getting the muscle mass and all of that that happens during male puberty? In theory, I guess it's possible, but it doesn't seem likely, particularly given that transgender girls and women who don't go through puberty, you can't even tell, right? You can't tell that they were born male. So, to me, I don't see any basis, certainly in the science, for saying that transgender girls and women who did not go through male puberty should be prohibited in any way. Now, they still have to block testosterone because, if you don't, if you stop taking the hormones at some point, or you don't have the surgery, then, obviously you would go through male puberty. But there's no cause for banning them, in my view. We had an interesting case here in college. A transgender woman was at San Jose State College in California. She played volleyball. It is a mid-level program. It's a Division I program, which is the highest division in college sports, but it wasn't one of the top programs in the country by a long shot. And she was fully accepted as a woman. Nobody knew that she was trans, and she made the mistake of telling her roommate, who also was a teammate of hers on the volleyball team, that she was trans. And her roommate went public with that information, and it led to a whole uproar. The teams that they were set to play against refused to play against them and forfeited their games against them, saying that they wouldn't play against a trans girl. It resulted in lawsuits. Ultimately, she and the team won their lawsuits about her participation, although it was on a technicality of how much time there was before the next game. It wasn't decided on its merits. But, here's an instance where no one could tell, no one had any idea. She wasn't at one of the top programs. She wasn't even the best player on her own team. So it wasn't like she was head and shoulders above all the other players. So you couldn't argue on the merits of her play that she had any advantage, and yet just learning that she was transgender, caused this whole ruckus. But that's kind of where we are. And in the absence of science and enough studies being able to show that she has no advantage, that's how these things flourish. In any case, okay, so things to think about. There are many problems with these black and white solutions of trying to ban transgender participation, which is where we in the US at least seem to be headed. And as I mentioned before, this is way overblown when you look at the numbers. This is not a huge surge in male participation in female sports like you hear from the proponents of these bans. There were 4 trans athletes who participated in the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, 3 who participated last summer in Paris. But we didn't hear about that because none of those athletes were successful. None of those athletes won or indeed did anything worth noting. So that kind of cuts against the notion that there should be a ban if the very, very few who even are participating aren't doing well enough to argue that it's unfair to have them participate. So the second thing is, when the laws are not carefully drafted, there can be anomalous results. So there was a case in Texas here where a transgender boy named Mac Beggs was a wrestler, and Mac was born female, living as a boy, and he wanted to wrestle with the boys. But per Texas law, he was not allowed to wrestle with the boys. He had to wrestle with the girls if he was to wrestle at all. But of course, because he was taking testosterone, which builds muscle and strength, that doesn't seem like the right solution, right? The girls and the parents of the girls who were wrestlers didn't want him to wrestle with them either, for understandable reasons. But that leaves him with no place to wrestle. So sometimes when these laws aren't drawn carefully enough, you have results that actually turn on their head what the law is ostensibly trying to do. Again, I think there are big differences between these categories that should lead to different results based on whether we're talking about youth sports or more elite sports. I do understand when there are things at stake, like the Olympic, glory that comes with the Olympic movement, the money you can get with endorsements, playing in a professional league for money. Even in college, there is value to a scholarship. And now in the US, this is a whole nother lecture topic, but now that college students can earn money from name, image, and likeness, and even be paid by the colleges more or less directly for their participation on the teams, which I think is the next thing coming. There is value to that. So you can see why there are rules about testosterone, since it's really the only measure that we have that we know at least has some validity. But it's just, the question is, what should those limits be? And if I have a pitch for what I think should happen, it's that I think that the International Olympic Committee and the NCAA should get involved enough to set at least some sort of ceiling, right? Like they should set the testosterone level that the federations can't go below. They can't make it even more limiting. And I say that because there's a lot of pressure here from these activists and advocates who don't want trans people to participate at all. And so they're trying to move the testosterone levels, lower, really just to deny participation altogether. So I think that while I think the federation should be able to be more lenient, I think there should be kind of a ceiling or a floor, however you want to characterize it, set by these governing bodies, the IOC and the NCAA, so that they at least can ensure that for those transgender athletes who follow the rules and do what they need to do medically, that they will have an opportunity to participate. So that would be my suggestion, more as a policy matter, of course, than an issue for you all to think about as you potentially litigate these cases. But again, fascinating topic. I look forward to hearing a little, if we have time, about what you are seeing in this area. And with that, I'll stop.
Does anyone have any question for Professor?
I do, but before Mrs. Mariana, she lift up her hand too. Go ahead, Mariana.
Well, thank you, Philomena. Do you hear me, people?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Well, first of all, Professor Rogers, I would like to thank you. This is really a fascinating topic. And I would like to thank you for this brilliant reflections you brought to us today. I think it's particularly applicable to Brazil, the idea that the fairness is relative, especially because we have a country of massive, how do we call it, inequalities, desigualdades. I don't know the name. If anyone could help me right now, the word for desigualdades.
I would say maybe inequalities.
Okay, inequalities. Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. And I work at the House of Representatives here in Brazil, and we have never had a massive number of conservative representatives as we have right now. So it's a moment where topics like this really call the attention of the public. But we have some bills, some draft bills for if not for banning the transgender people, at least for considering the biological gender the only criteria applicable to define the category where the athlete will perform. But how can I say, just to give you a word of what's going on. So we have those drafts, but they are quite calm right now, okay? We're not voting them. They're not under a real debate. They are like, okay, they were proposed, but they are like where they were since from the beginning. So no big movements for their approval right now. But of course, if it happens a case like the Leah Thomas case, for example, and then we are going to have all this debate started again. And when we talk about the Leah Thomas case, I remember it when it happened because I really like the swimming scenario. And what happened when I refer to that moment when she won the competition and the opponents refused to be near her. So they were like, no, we are not recognizing this competition. We're not recognizing her as the winner. And I wondered at that time, and I wonder again, whether it could be considered a transphobic action by this athlete, because it's this is an issue that is very, very complicated here in Brazil, because our Supreme Court has decided, it's been some years from now, that these transphobic actions are a kind of racism. So it's a racism based on social, the social race, let's say, something like this, because we don't have any specific crime for the transphobic act. So they do like an analogy to consider it as a racism. So my question is, was there some debate about the attitude of these opponents who were not recognizing her title, or okay, this is under the Constitution of the US, as we have all the freedom of speech as a right. So so much, how can I say, no, it's so important for you. So is that okay for them to do this, or was it something that was questioned as, oh my God, where can they go to protest against something like this? So thank you very much.
So I think you answered your own question. In the US, our freedom of speech is so strong that, you know, you can always express your opinion, right? These women who competed against Leah Thomas and didn't like her or wanted to protest can say anything they want, right? Obviously, we have hate crimes. Had they committed a crime against her and it was for the reason that she was a transgender person, then yes, perhaps prosecutor could try to charge them with a hate crime if they assaulted her or something and it was because she was trans. But if they just say, listen, I didn't lose to a woman, I lost to a man, she's not a woman, this is unfair, this is terrible. There's nothing wrong with that in our system legally. If she was discriminated against, like say the organizers refused to give her her medal because she's trans, she could sue. And if she could prove discrimination, she would win that suit. But otherwise, you know, this whole kind of shunning of these athletes and this just societal disapproval or refusing to even acknowledge their existence, there's nothing that can be done about that as long as it kind of comes under freedom of speech. I mean, I would argue, particularly if you're in the sporting world, it's particularly, to me, unfortunate and even despicable, I guess I would say, for people who are supposed to be supportive of women in sports to take that view. Women in sports have had a tough enough time as it is, right? Getting the respect, getting the resources, getting people to pay attention. You know, to me, I don't see why you turn on someone like that. But that's not actionable, right? That's just me saying, let's value inclusion over fairness. But yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Our freedom of speech in the US is so strong that we do not have anything that says you can't like insult or shun someone who's transgender. You definitely can, and they definitely do.
Maria, can go ahead.
Oh, first of all, it's a big pleasure. It's a privilege to listen to your lecture, Professor Rogers. And I want to say that it's a big challenge for all of us to face such a problem of if transgenders are allowed to compete under the gender they have decided they are identified. It's not a yes or no answer. It's not a black or white topic issue. It's something that we have to reconcile. We have to uh, the right the right for them to everyone, whatever race they are, whatever sex option they have decided, how they identify themselves. They have the right to compete in sports. But at the same time, we have to guarantee justice, equality. We have to guarantee fairness in sports competitions. Competitors cannot have physical advantages over others. And that's the big challenge we have. It's not only testosterone levels that can indicate if someone has, if a male birth person has against a woman birth person. As you said, mass, muscle mass, bone mass, all the breathing, the cardiological capacity changes, influences in the power and influences in the way they practice sports. So that's the big challenge we have. There are many actions in terms to search, to go forward, equality in sports. I can remember a couple of years ago, the International Swimming Federation prohibit some kind a swimming suit that was fabricated under a technology that gave advantages against others in swimming quicker, and it was prohibited because it was considered an unfair instrument. And as you said, well, you focus on the U.S. youth sports, but sports are globalized, and the United States is a member of the International Olympic Committee, and the International Olympic Committee, I think 2-3 years ago, issued a statement that does not prohibit transsexuals to compete, like male that were transitioned to women to compete as women, and they transferred that regulations to every sports federations. So they would, under their characteristics, under the rules, evaluate how they would take that in order to allow or not transgenders to compete. So how do you think that solution brought by the International Olympic Committee is the best way? Let every sport under their circumstances decide what would be the parameters to be followed to decide how transgender should or not compete?
I think it's okay because I do wish the IOC would wish they would say, you, World Athletics or international swimming or whatever the sport is, cannot require a testosterone level that is below the normal upper level for cisgender women. Because when you start requiring a level of testosterone for trans athletes that is lower than some of the cisgender women have naturally, what you're really doing is saying, we don't want transgender athletes to participate. We're really trying to exclude them altogether. And I don't think that that is okay and within the spirit of what the Olympics and other international sporting events ought to be. And I think that there's a lot of pressure about this on the IOC, but there's even more perhaps on the individual international sporting federations, and they're not as capable perhaps of withstanding that pressure. So I think the IOC should say, listen, we'll take the heat. We're going to find that this is the limit of what you can require, because otherwise you're basically saying they can't participate at all. So I wish that they would take that stance, but I do agree that there's no reason for some of them, depending on the sport, to require really low testosterone levels if testosterone is not super helpful in that particular sport. So I do agree with the variations, but I do wish they would to go to floor, because the next thing we have, if World Athletics makes it any lower, there will be no possibility of transgender participation. That's my view.
Well, just another point that you mentioned, that there's not much differences between transgenders and other athletes. Between children, you missed 8, 9, 10. At least in Brazil, I have not heard about transgenders that young. There are no transgenders at 8, 9, 10. And the law does not allow any kind of procedures for sexual transition under 18 years old.
Yeah, I noticed that. I thought it said 16, but I noticed that Brazil doesn't allow really puberty blocking. And listen, there are a lot of issues with that, because now you're talking about minors who, are not allowed to make a lot of important decisions. And yet this is obviously a huge decision, and it implicates parental rights, all sorts of things. But if you don't block puberty, you're in a whole nother place. I mean, if you, as a child, as a 10-year-old child, born a boy, but know inside that you're a girl, if you don't block puberty, you're never going to be able to live as a woman in the way that you can if you do block puberty. Because once you go through male puberty, I mean, obviously, as we all know, it's so many changes to your body. It just makes a huge difference. So in the US, still in at least most states, we'll see where this all goes with the new administration, but you can take puberty blocking medicine. You can't get surgery. I'm not talking about surgery, but you can block puberty. And if you do that, then you do that until you're 18, then or 16 or whatever, then you can get the surgery. And from then on, you're done. But I wasn't really necessarily talking even about kids who are doing anything yet, but just kids who want to participate on girls' teams. So, if you're someone who wants to live as a girl, you want to play soccer with the girls because you have long hair and you wear dresses, it doesn't mean that you're taking medicine or that you've had any surgeries. It just means that you want to participate. And my point is just at that stage of life, there's no reason not to let people participate. If they're living, as a girl, if they identify as a girl, they don't have to prove that they're transgender in any medical or surgical way. But in the US, they do start early with puberty blockers, and in other parts of the world too, in Europe. And that makes a huge difference to how these people can actually live as women going forward. So it's really important with, of course, the caveat that it is a big deal and a big decision. And, you know, it's a complicated issue because they are minors, and the notion of making a decision. Puberty blocking is reversible, but obviously surgery is not. So there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in that. But that's what I was talking about, not, you know, the surgery at 10 years old or anything like that.
Does anybody else have any question?
Just have a question. I'm Mr. Rogers. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Just introduction, because we know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg also was a groundbreaking on this matter, and we have a lot of precedents that she participated on. But I have a question regarding the studies, the medical studies. Do you have any medical studies to indicate us in regards to football, our football, like soccer, for us to study and develop a therapeutic use of exemptions for Brazil in order to study more our laws and develop our regulations too?
There have not, to my knowledge, been really sports-specific studies. There have been studies that involve certain measures of like strength and endurance. So there was a small study by Joanna Harper that measured things like grip strength and lung capacity, endurance, and, you know, other strength motions, and trying to determine whether transgender women who had gone through male puberty and transitioned afterwards, but were taking testosterone suppression hormones, you know, comparing them to cisgender women. Are they stronger? Do they have better lung capacity? That sort of thing. And these studies are so small as to be almost useless, right? Because there are just so few transgender athletes to study. But there was one study that showed that only grip strength was noticeable, the difference in grip strength. Otherwise, once you're suppressing your testosterone, there didn't seem to be a difference. But again, it's not really that reliable. And there certainly have not been studies like taking a big group of transgender women soccer players and comparing football players and comparing them to a group of cisgender women soccer players, and saying, you know, which group is faster, more coordinated, you know, better shooters. You know, those studies just don't exist, and they don't exist because there aren't enough athletes to put in these studies. I mean, I think more and more we're seeing scientists trying to do that, right? They're trying to create studies so that we know more about this to form the basis of laws and regulations about this topic, but we're not nearly there yet. One of the more interesting things to read, if you're interested in this, is actually on the DSD side, the Castro Semenya case. Castro Semenya fought and litigated for years for the right to compete as a runner in the 800 and the 400, battling against World Athletics every step of the way. And, you know, World Athletics tried to say, well, you know, the science shows that she's, you know, has all of these advantages over cisgender women. And it got reversed, and, you know, back and forth for years, because the science just isn't there. We just don't know. I mean, anecdotally, I think we all think, of course, you know, it matters going through puberty and getting bigger and stronger and muscle mass and bone mass. But it really hasn't been proven when you're comparing cisgender women to people born as men who went through male puberty, but then have taken all this testosterone suppression medication. So we just don't know. 10 years from now, we'll know a lot more, but sitting here today, we just don't.
Anybody else? No. So, Professor, like you said, this topic is fascinating, and I'm sure everybody here today really appreciate your lecture, your excellent lecture. And in name of Superior Court and our national school, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing with us your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. It was great to see you all. Hope to see you again. Good luck with everything.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Obrigado a todos aí pela presença, tá? Grande abraço.
Obrigada a você, Boulos e Gustavo. Muito bom. Muito bom mesmo.
Agradecer ao Gustavo, principalmente aí pela grande ideia.
Agradeci
Gustavo,
também.
parabéns.
Beijo, gente.
Valeu, um abraço a todos.